The entire airplane fell silent after a flight attendant suddenly called out one name over the speaker. "Is Senator J.D. Vance on board this flight?" In seconds, every passenger stopped talking. Some thought it was a security emergency. Others feared something had gone terribly wrong. But what happened next wasn't a scandal, an arrest, or a political confrontation. It was a single, unexpected moment that left an entire plane in tears and reminded everyone on board of the incredible power of kindness. Stay with me until the end, because this unforgettable story will change the way you see complete strangers. The entire airplane fell into complete silence. Just seconds earlier, the cabin had been alive with the familiar sounds of a routine flight. A young couple near the window quietly discussed their vacation plans. Across the aisle, a businessman typed the final lines of an email on his laptop. Several children laughed softly while watching cartoons on the seatback screens. Others rested peacefully beneath thin airline blankets as the steady hum of the engines filled the air. Then, everything changed. A calm but unmistakably serious voice came over the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? If Senator J.D. Vance is on board this flight, would you kindly identify yourself immediately?" The announcement echoed through the cabin. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. The laughter disappeared. The clicking of laptop keyboards came to an abrupt halt. Passengers slowly lifted their heads, exchanging puzzled and uneasy glances. Some removed their headphones, convinced they had misheard the announcement. Others leaned into the aisle, trying to see what was happening farther down the cabin. A quiet wave of whispers spread from one row to the next. Did she just say J.D. Vance? Why would they call him out like that? Is there some kind of emergency? The tension grew heavier with every passing second. No one knew why a flight attendant would make such an unusual announcement in front of hundreds of passengers. Commercial flights followed strict procedures, and public requests like this were incredibly rare. The uncertainty allowed everyone's imagination to race. Was there a security concern? Had someone reported a threat? Was there a problem with the aircraft? Or was something happening that nobody else knew about? Near the middle of the plane, a man sitting quietly by the window slowly closed the book resting in his hands. He had boarded the flight without attracting attention, dressed simply in a dark jacket, blue jeans, and a baseball cap. Like many public figures, he had hoped for an uneventful trip where he could read, relax, and avoid the spotlight. He looked around the cabin for a brief moment, realizing every pair of eyes seemed to be searching for the person mentioned in the announcement. Taking a slow breath, he calmly raised his hand. "I'm J.D. Vance," he said in an even, respectful voice. The nearest passengers immediately turned toward him. A few looked surprised, while others exchanged knowing glances after recognizing his face. The whispers grew louder, but nobody dared to speak above a murmur. Moments later, a flight attendant approached his row. Her expression remained professional, yet there was something unusually serious in her eyes. She offered a polite smile before speaking quietly. "Sir, would you mind coming with me for just a moment?" J.D. Vance nodded without asking questions. He stood, placed a bookmark inside his novel, and stepped into the aisle. As he followed the flight attendant toward the front of the aircraft, the silence became almost overwhelming. Every passenger watched him walk past, wondering what could possibly require such an unexpected request. No one reached for a camera. No one interrupted. Even those who had been asleep were now fully awake, trying to make sense of the unfolding mystery. The aircraft continued smoothly through the clouds, but inside the cabin, it felt as though time itself had stopped. No one knew what was about to happen, and that unanswered question made the silence even louder. Inside the quiet galley near the cockpit, the atmosphere was completely different from the curious tension filling the passenger cabin. The soft hum of the aircraft engines continued in the background as the lead flight attendant gently closed the curtain, giving the conversation a moment of privacy. She turned toward J.D. Vance with an apologetic smile. "Sir, I'm truly sorry for interrupting your flight," she began in a calm voice. "I know you were hoping for a quiet trip, and we normally would never call out a passenger publicly, but this situation felt different." J.D. Vance listened without interrupting. He could tell from her expression that whatever she was about to say was important. The flight attendant took a slow breath before continuing. "There's an elderly gentleman seated in 22A. He's traveling by himself, and when I checked on him earlier, I noticed he seemed unusually emotional. At first, I thought he might not be feeling well, but after speaking with him for a few minutes, he shared something deeply personal." She paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "He told me he recently lost his wife. They had been married for nearly 50 years. This is his first flight since her passing, and he admitted he's struggling more than he expected." J.D. Vance's expression immediately softened. The flight attendant continued quietly. "While we were talking, he happened to recognize you. He said he once read your memoir during one of the hardest chapters of his life. He told me parts of your story reminded him that people can survive difficult circumstances, even when life feels overwhelming." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant rumble of the aircraft moving steadily through the clouds. The attendant smiled gently. "He doesn't want to disturb you. He specifically told me he doesn't want a picture or an autograph. He simply said that if he could shake your hand for 1 minute and thank you in person, it would mean more to him than you'll ever know." J.D. Vance looked down thoughtfully. He wasn't thinking about politics or public appearances. He was thinking about the man sitting alone, several rows behind them, carrying a kind of grief that no suitcase could hold. After a few quiet seconds, he looked back at the flight attendant and smiled warmly. "Of course," he said without hesitation. "Let's go see him." Relief spread across the attendant's face. "Thank you, sir," she replied. "I think this will mean the world to him." Together, they stepped back into the aisle and began walking toward seat 22A. Although the passengers couldn't hear the conversation that had taken place, many noticed the change in J.D. Vance's expression. The uncertainty that had filled the cabin moments earlier had been replaced by quiet curiosity. As they approached the elderly passenger, the man slowly looked up from the folded photograph resting in his hands. His tired eyes widened in disbelief. For a second, he seemed convinced he was imagining the moment. I didn't think you'd actually come," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. J.D. Vance smiled gently, reached out his hand, and leaned slightly closer. "I heard you wanted to say hello," he said. The elderly man looked at the outstretched hand for a moment before taking it with both of his own. Almost instantly, tears filled his eyes. For the first time since boarding the plane, the weight he had been quietly carrying seemed just a little lighter. The cabin remained unusually quiet as J.D. Vance settled into the empty seat beside the elderly passenger. The mystery that had filled the airplane only minutes earlier had now turned into quiet curiosity. Passengers occasionally glanced toward them, wondering what could be so important that a United States senator had left his own seat to spend time with a complete stranger. For several moments, neither man spoke. The elderly gentleman looked down at the worn photograph resting in his hands. It showed him standing beside a smiling woman in front of a small white house. The edges of the picture had become faded with time, but the memories it carried were still vivid. Finally, he took a deep breath. "My wife and I were married for almost 50 years, he said softly. She wasn't just my wife. She was my best friend. We did everything together. His voice trembled as he continued. We traveled together, raised our children together, celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays together. I never imagined there would come a day when I'd have to do any of those things alone. J.D. Vance listened quietly, giving the man his full attention. He didn't interrupt or try to fill the silence. Sometimes, the greatest kindness is simply allowing someone to be heard. The elderly passenger smiled faintly through his sadness. After she passed away, the house became so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking in every room. I found myself talking to her photograph just to feel like she was still there. He paused, taking another slow breath. There were days I didn't want to leave the house. I wondered if life would ever feel normal again. He looked toward the airplane window, watching the endless sea of clouds drifting beneath them. One afternoon, someone gave me your memoir. I didn't read it because of politics. I read it because it was a story about overcoming hardship and refusing to let difficult circumstances define your future. A gentle smile appeared on his face. It reminded me that pain doesn't last forever. It reminded me that even after losing something precious, people can still find reasons to keep moving forward. He turned toward J.D. Vance with eyes filled with gratitude. I just wanted to thank you. You'll probably never realize how much those words helped me during the darkest season of my life. J.D. Vance nodded quietly. Instead of talking about himself or discussing public life, he asked a simple question. What was your wife's name? The elderly man's face immediately brightened. Margaret, he answered with a warm smile. She had the most beautiful laugh you've ever heard. For the next several minutes, he shared one memory after another. He described the day they first met at a small town fair, where he nervously asked her to dance. He laughed while remembering how she always insisted on singing in the car, even though she couldn't carry a tune. He smiled as he talked about raising 3 children, watching them become parents themselves, and spending countless evenings on the front porch together as the sun disappeared behind the hills. At one point, they both laughed. A few moments later, tears quietly rolled down the old man's cheeks. Then, through those tears, he smiled again. Nearby passengers couldn't hear every word, but they could see the emotion on the man's face. Whatever was being said, it was bringing him comfort. Even the flight attendants slowed their work for a moment, careful not to interrupt such a deeply personal conversation. It was a simple reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness leave the biggest impact. Eventually, J.D. Vance stood to return to his seat. Before he could leave, the elderly man gently reached out and held his hand one last time. His voice was barely above a whisper. Today is the first day I've smiled since the funeral. The words seemed to linger in the air, long after they were spoken. Several passengers nearby quietly wiped away tears, realizing they had just witnessed something far more powerful than a conversation. They had witnessed the healing power of compassion. What happened next was something no one on that airplane could have predicted. The quiet conversation between J.D. Vance and the elderly passenger had ended, but its impact was only beginning. Without a single announcement or a request, a ripple of kindness started moving through the cabin, spreading from one road to the next, like gentle waves across a calm lake. For several moments, no one spoke. Passengers simply watched as J.D. Vance returned to his seat with a humble smile. The elderly man remained in seat 22A, still holding the photograph of his late wife. His eyes were red from tears, but there was something different about him now. The sadness was still there, yet it had been joined by something he hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. Across the aisle, a businessman who had quietly witnessed a conversation pressed the flight attendant's call button. When she arrived, he leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. "I'd like to pay for that gentleman's upgrade on his connecting flight," he said. "If there's an opportunity to give him a little more comfort for the rest of his journey, I'd be honored to cover the cost." The flight attendant smiled, genuinely touched by the unexpected gesture. "I'll see what I can do," she replied. The businessman simply nodded and returned to reading his newspaper, never looking for recognition or thanks. A few rows behind them, another passenger quietly approached during a break in the flight. "Sir," he said kindly to the elderly man, "if you need any help carrying your luggage after we land, I'd be happy to assist you." The older gentleman looked surprised. "You don't have to do that," he replied softly. The passenger smiled. "I know," he said. "I just want to." A little later, a family traveling with 2 young children asked the flight attendant if they could give the man something. The children had spent several minutes carefully writing a short message on a small piece of paper using colorful crayons from their travel bag. When the note was handed to him, he unfolded it with trembling hands. In large, uneven letters, it simply read, "You are not alone." For a long moment, he stared at those 4 words. Then he gently folded the note and placed it inside the same wallet where he kept the photograph of his wife. It was a gesture he clearly intended to treasure. By now, the atmosphere inside the aircraft had completely transformed. The passengers who had boarded as strangers were smiling at one another. Conversations began naturally between people who had never met before. Some shared travel stories, while others simply exchanged warm greetings across the aisle. Even the flight attendants noticed the remarkable change. One of them quietly whispered to another, "I've worked hundreds of flights, and I've never seen an entire cabin change like this." There had been no emergency, no argument, no delay, no dramatic confrontation, just one simple act of compassion that inspired another and another, until an entire airplane seemed connected by kindness. Before returning fully to his own seat, J.D. Vance paused to thank the cabin crew. "You really didn't have to involve me," he said sincerely. The lead flight attendant smiled warmly. "Actually, sir," she replied, "I don't think this was only for him." She glanced around the peaceful cabin before continuing. "I think everyone on this flight needed this reminder." For the remainder of the journey, the airplane felt different. The usual silence of strangers was replaced by quiet conversations, genuine smiles, and small acts of generosity. As the aircraft continued its path through the clouds, it no longer felt like hundreds of unrelated travelers sharing the same flight. For a few unforgettable hours, they had become something much rarer, a community brought together by a single moment of compassion that none of them would ever forget. As the aircraft began its final descent, the captain announced that they would be landing in just a few minutes. The familiar sounds of seatbelts clicking into place and tray tables being folded echoed through the cabin. Outside the windows, the city slowly came into view, its streets and buildings growing larger as the plane descended through the clouds. Normally, this was the moment when passengers became impatient. People would gather their belongings before the aircraft even reached the gate. Some would stand in the aisle the instant the seatbelt sign turned off, eager to be the first to leave. But this flight was different. When the plane touched down and rolled safely toward the terminal, an unusual calm remained throughout the cabin. The seatbelt sign switched off with its familiar chime, yet almost no one moved. Instead of rushing into the aisle, many passengers stayed in their seats for a few extra moments. Some looked out the window in quiet thought, while others exchanged gentle smiles with the strangers sitting beside them. It was as though everyone wanted to hold on to the feeling that had transformed the flight. A few moments later, the elderly gentleman in seat 22A slowly stood. He carefully picked up his small carry-on bag and slipped the faded photograph of his late wife back into his jacket pocket. His movements were slow, but there was a quiet confidence in him that hadn't been there when he first boarded the plane. As he walked toward the front of the cabin, something remarkable happened. Passengers standing in the aisle stepped aside to give him room to pass. Several smiled warmly and wished him a safe journey. A young mother gently squeezed his hand and said, "Take care of yourself." A businessman who had barely spoken during the flight nodded respectfully and wished him brighter days ahead. Others didn't say anything at all. Their kind smiles said enough. The elderly man thanked each person with quiet gratitude, clearly overwhelmed by the compassion surrounding him. Just before reaching the aircraft door, he paused. He slowly turned around and looked toward J.D. Vance, who was gathering his belongings a few rows behind him. For a brief moment, the entire cabin seemed to grow silent once again. The elderly man's eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice trembled, but his smile remained steady. "You gave me hope when I needed it most. I boarded this plane feeling completely alone. Today, I'm leaving with something I thought I had lost." J.D. Vance smiled warmly and gently shook his head. "No," he replied. "I think today we all helped each other." Those simple words touched everyone within earshot. Even the flight attendants, who had witnessed countless journeys over the years, admitted later that they had rarely seen strangers become connected so quickly through such a simple act of kindness. As passengers stepped into the terminal, they carried far more than backpacks, briefcases, and suitcases. They carried a story they would tell their families. They carried a reminder that compassion still exists in a world often filled with noise and division. They carried proof that one thoughtful decision can inspire countless others to do the same. No cameras had captured the moment. No reporters had been waiting at the gate. There were no flashing lights, breaking headlines, or applause. Just ordinary people choosing kindness when they had every opportunity to remain strangers. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to listen. Sometimes, it begins with a flight attendant asking one unexpected question. And sometimes, one quiet conversation at 30,000 feet becomes a memory that stays with everyone on board long after the journey has ended. If this fictional story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that even the smallest act of kindness can change a person's life forever.